Thank you. I'm going to give a brief description of nuclear power, but first I'd like to go back to what Diane said about Detroit. Because for most people that don't know, Detroit was once the 5th largest city in the United States. And because of its productive capability, not just in Detroit, but the entire region, you had a living standard that was the highest in the world. And that living standard has been collapsed to the point of virtually, you could call it a third world nation sitting inside the geographic limits of the United States. Now, what's important about Detroit was its productive capability. Now, nuclear power fits right into that in a couple of ways. For people that don't know how nuclear power works, I'll just briefly go through it. You have a pressure vessel, because I've worked in a number of nuclear plants, both here in New Jersey and elsewhere, of different types and different sizes. I live in the shadow of a nuclear plant, actually, in Ocean County, the Oyster Creek nuclear plant, which is in fact scheduled to be shut down very shortly, as a number of other plants have already been shut down and dismantled. And in fact, if you look at the history of nuclear power, many of our plants, although they've reached a time span where recently they've had to undergo major changes. So in a sense, you could say they're starting to reach their maximum range of usefulness. There are now on the drawing boards different types of nuclear power plants, 4th generation power plants, which could easily replace them, maybe not even in the same place. Most of the nuclear, the type I'm talking about, are both meltdown proof, much more efficient. Consequently, they could even be located in the middle of a major city like New York City, if you wanted, very safely, very efficiently. But in any case, the ones I've worked on require fuel rods, what's called a fuel rod. If you want to think about it real simply, a nuclear power plant, the reactor vessel, is a big teapot. That's all it is, except that you don't have your energy source for producing steam, which is how it operates, is not outside, it's inside. And inside that are fuel rods. And the control of those fuel rods are regulated by a type of material which, by either integrating it with the fuel rods or pulling it out of the fuel rods, will determine how much reaction you have going on in the vessel. And out of that, all you're basically doing is producing steam. In a boiling water reactor, like by where I live, that steam goes directly from the reactor to your turbines, turns your turbine blades, and at the end of that, you have your electrical generator. And that's where you're getting your electricity from. Now, in a pressure water reactor like we have in Salem 1 and Salem 2, because we have 4 plants in New Jersey, Hope Creek is another boiling water reactor. But in those types, you have what's called a primary loop and a secondary loop. Your primary loop is in the terms in the nuclear industry is your dirty loop, because it involves radioactive, coming in contact with radiation. Even though one of the purposes is to keep the water as clean as possible, right? Because you don't want to have different parts of the plant, either the piping or your turbine blades, become very radioactive, because you do have to do maintenance on them. They have to be fully disassembled, and I'm talking huge units, the size of this, this room here, would be a half. You'd have another half underneath. You pull them apart, and your turbines, which are just a shaft with blades on them, to take that steam and turn them, into the power necessary to drive your generator. So you want to be able to work on them, because I've worked on many of them. Even inside, like I say, a boiling water reactor. On a pressure water reactor, that secondary loop, your primary water goes through a huge series of radiators. And what you're doing is taking the steam from your primary loop and you're transferring it, turning steam in a clean loop. So now you have your piping, your turbines, and everything else is clean. No radioactivity involved. So it's much easier to work on. So that's really the essence of how a nuclear power plant works. I mean, yeah, there's lots of piping, there's lots of electronics. The electronics alone is comparable to what you would think of involving the space program, because you have a series of backups. Most plants have 3 backups, 3 series of safety backups in all systems, so that if one fails, you have a backup to that, and if that one fails, you have a backup to that. And you also have emergency systems to be able to bring your reactor down from an operating mode down to an idle mode. So it's an extremely safe system. And as I said, when you get into your newer generations, they're even safer still. Now, the reason they went so early on to nuclear power is because of its efficiency. Compared to burning wood or burning coal or anything even above that, there's no comparison in its capability. And if you want to talk about solar energy, you're even talking even lower than that. So for any our nation or any other nation to be roped into this idea of solar energy is totally incomprehensible. And let me even make that a little bit clearer using the issue of the sun. Because if you take the sun, which is 96 million miles away, focused on Earth, right, and you take say a square meter, right, the amount of energy after 96 million miles reaching that collector, solar collector, is how diffuse. How diffuse is that possible? Now let's take thermonuclear fusion. Let's bring that sun down here, because that's that's what we're doing with thermonuclear reactors. You're taking the power of the sun, a dynamic process, in fact, a process which most people call a fourth state of matter, because you're dealing with an energetic, dynamic plasma. And the whole purpose of developing this next generation, beyond what's the 4th generation of normal nuclear reactors, is a reactor whose sole purpose is to take the same process that goes on the sun, self-organizing process, creating its own magnetic fields, and create the conditions here, man-made magnets, and identifying the different activities that go on, and attempting to moderate them in a way that you can make it useful. Now, let me give you an idea of that, because if you go to the plasma reactor down at Princeton, if you're standing here and that reactor is operating, you're here at room temperature. But if you go on the other side of that wall, the temperature is 500 million degrees. Right? So now that's the energy potential you're dealing with, and the capability to figure out ways of drawing that off, either through direct electrical energy or other means, is really what's ahead as far as the next Apollo project, if you will, because that's where we need to go. Now, Diane can tell you, she's visited there, and they will tell you that at the rate that it's being funded now, because of budget constraints, they'll never get there. They'll never take that capability of researching and developing that as a functioning, usable reactor and never be able to make it commercially feasible. And that's really one of the tasks ahead of us here, because that is the potential. It's not just energy even. because just like when they started the development of nuclear energy, one of the speeches Kennedy gave before the Congress was, we have to develop a nuclear spacecraft, which in fact they were in the process of developing back in the 60s. And when they extrapolated its rate of development and where it might fit in to going to Mars, because that was potentially probably the best option, they figured we'd be on Mars by 1984 using that technology. And if you take the potential for thermonuclear fusion and extrapolate that into usable technology for spacecraft, you know, as Mr. LaRouche said, you could have a 1G gravity spacecraft that could potentially move at a continuing 1 gravity, that making possible travel from not here, because it's a little bit different, but from somewhere like the moon, which is where we should have been already, and moving from there to Mars in, I think, approximately 1 week's time. So that's the potential. That's what's being sat on right now. So that's really where we need to be going. And if you take, now let me get a little bit back to Detroit. Because if you go back to Detroit, what was it in places like Camden and you know, other places like Patterson? What were they? They were the industrial capability to make available the basis to do things like take nuclear power and make it standardized, which would cheapen the cost. That was one of the major problems with it. It was never standardized. It's like everybody having a different Model T, you know. That's really the way the nuclear industry ended up. But if it was ever standardized such that all your manufacturers could be, you know, producing the same thing, and you had interchangeability, which you never had in to a large extent in the nuclear industry, even the cost of what they say is astronomical now could have been massively brought down, right? So that's really where Detroit, or say Camden. Let me just make it one more point with Camden, because if we're going to deliver, if we're going to produce, because right now we can't even produce the major components for nuclear power plants, but if we could, and if we wanted to transport them, say, to somewhere else, one of the best ways to do that is by shipping. So what is Camden? Well, Camden at one time was the biggest shipyard in the world, sitting right here. It was also the shipyard that produced the first nuclear-powered transport vessel, shipping vessel, you know, beyond the Navy, what the Navy did with, you know, aircraft carriers, submarines, things like that. But that's what Camden did. That's the history of places that existed here in New Jersey, that existed in places like Detroit and Ohio, out on the West Coast. And this is what we have to bring back, because what you're talking about is tens of millions of high-wage, skilled jobs, right? So I'll leave it at that.